Hello everyone, my name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about containers, Kubernetes, Go as a programming language, distributed systems, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So if you have been liking the kinds of videos that I make, you should consider subscribing to the channel and you should follow me on Twitter as well. In this particular video, we are going to talk about what exactly are Kubernetes volume populators, because in the last video we just looked into data source and data source ref fields of the persistent volume claim resource and how they are useful to create a persistent volume claim from an existing PVC resource or from an existing volume snapshot resource. So this video is going to be the second part of the same series. So if I try to quickly summarize the things that we talked about in the last video, so using data source field of the PVC resource, we can create a new PVC from an existing PVC or from an existing volume snapshot resource. But data source field cannot accept any other resource than PVC or volume snapshot, and that is the reason data source ref fields are introduced, let's say, so that we can specify any resource as the value for data source ref field. So data source ref fields can accept the things that data source accepts, for example PVC and volume snapshot, and apart from that, in addition to that, data source ref also accepts any custom resource that is available in your Kubernetes cluster. So this is I would say the most important thing to understand here. If you just specify a particular, let's say, resource here, how does the new PVC that is going to get created would have some data, let's say, because that is our eventual goal, that we want to create new PVC with some existing data, and that is our eventual goal. But you might think, I have just specified this CR here, how is this going to help us creating a PVC with some existing data? And that is the thing that we are going to focus into today. So now, if you remember, I also talked about when we specify something as the value of data source field under PVC resource, in that case there is no, I would say, validation, or even if we specify invalid values for a data source field, in that case we are not going to see any error, and we would see the problems eventually, but we would not see any errors. So for example, if I specify data source field using let's say volume snapshot, but we do not specify volume snapshot correctly, we are not going to see any error, but the PVC is not going to get created with the correct volume snapshot data. So errors get silently ignored, let's say, in case of data source field, but in case of data source ref field, errors are not ignored. Errors are basically, if the source that you have specified, if there is something wrong with the source, things are not going to work. So basically you should have a validator that can validate if the source that is specified here under data source ref is a valid populator source, let's say, or not. So once we have validated that the source that is specified here is actually valid source, in that case, that is where another part of this entire thing comes into picture. That is where there should be a component that is able to, let's say, look into this particular field here under data source ref and able to do some things, right? So now we are talking about two components, let's say. The first component is the validator that is going to validate if the CR that is specified here is a valid valid volume populator or not. And the second, once the validation has happened, the second component is actually going to be responsible to make sure that the new PVC that is going to get created is going to get created with some data that is implemented in the volume populator. So we have two components that we would like to talk about here. Now, the other thing that I would like to highlight is, so our eventual goal is that the new PVC that is going to get created would have some existing data. And because it's my use case, I am writing this volume populator, I should know which particular data do we want to create new PVC with. And if I know all the parameters, all the things that I need to create the new PVC with some existing data, that those are all the things that are going to be part of this CR that I'm specifying here. So you are going to create a CR, and as part of that CR, you are going to expect everything that you need to populate the PVC with your existing data. I hope that makes sense, but I can try to summarize it again. So that is the thing that you are going to specify under dataSourceRef field. And once you have, so for example, in this particular case, again, this is just an example, the volume populator that we are going to implement eventually might not have this same kind. So let's say I have created a custom resource. The API group under which that custom resource is available is viveksingh.dev, and the kind of that new custom resource is HTTP Volume Populator. And I have created an instance of that CR, and I'm going to specify that particular instance under dataSourceRef field. So this is how we specify any custom resource under dataSourceRef field of PVC resource. Now let's go ahead and talk about these two components that we talked about. The first component is going to be the data source populator, the data source validator. So that is going to validate the resource that we have specified here. And the second component is going to be actual controller that is going to populate your PVC with new data. And that controller that I'm talking about, that is going to have your logic, and that controller is going to get all the details that are required to populate the data from this CR. And this CR can have any field that you want to. So we have two fields here, two things to talk about here. So validator and the actual controller that is going to do the things. So now let's talk about validator. So when you create a volume populator, let's say I have created a volume populator here called HTTP Volume Populator that exists under the API group viveksingh.dev. And so when you create a volume populator, you somehow have to tell Kubernetes that this particular volume populator is a valid volume populator. And you can do that by creating another resource called volume populator. So you have to create an instance of volume populator, and using this particular resource, you can specify that this particular kind and API group is a valid volume populator. So in our case, because we want to treat HTTP Volume Populator from viveksingh.dev a valid volume populator, what we will have to do is we will have to create a volume populator resource, and this volume populator resource is just going to, let's say, register our volume populator with Kubernetes, so that the validator that we are talking about here, the validator would be able to make sure that the API group and kind that is specified here is actually a valid data source, because I have registered that using volume populator CR, using volume populator resource. So I hope that makes sense. So let's go ahead and try to quickly look into what exactly or how exactly this volume populator resource looks like. So this volume populator resource is not available by default, and you will have to install volume populator. You will have to install a custom resource definition on your Kubernetes cluster to make sure that volume populator CRs are available on your Kubernetes cluster. And to do that, this is how. So this is the CRD. I already have the CRD downloaded locally, and if you see here, this is the custom resource definition. This is the same CRD that we have here. So this is a custom resource definition that is going to introduce a new custom resource called volume populator and in group populator.storage.k8s.io. So if I try to summarize, if I am creating a new volume populator if I'm creating a new volume populator, I will have to, let's say that populator is called HTTP volume populator. In that case, what we will have to do is to make sure that Kubernetes knows about my volume populator. I will have to register my volume populator with Kubernetes using this particular resource, using volume populator from populator.storage.k8s.io. So you will have to first install this particular CRD, and once you have installed the CRD, you will have volume populator resources available, and you can create an instance of volume populator resource registering your volume populator. And if you see here, I'm registering HTTP volume populator resource under viveksingh.dev, and after this, when I create my PVC specifying this dataSourceRef, in that case volume populator is not going to complain because I have registered my volume populator by creating a volume populator resource. So I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, feel free to reach out to me. I would be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. So now that we have registered our volume populator using volume populator resource, we can actually, so this validator component that we talked about here is again not available by default. So you will have to install this validator. I mean, it's optional. You can install so that you get notified if if the resource that has been specified under dataSourceRef is a valid volume populator or not. If you don't have the validator installed, in that case, you don't have a way to figure out, or there is nothing running that is going to tell you that the data source that you have specified is invalid data source. So that is the reason you will have to install validator, and validator component is just a very simple controller that is already written by the community. You don't have to write this controller, you just have to install this controller. And as soon as you create a PVC resource using dataSourceRef field, this validator component is going to look into the dataSourceRef field, and it is going to figure out if this populator is a valid populator or not. And we have talked about how would validator figure out if it's valid populator or not, and it's by looking at volume populator resources. So if our resource is registered as a volume populator resource, in that case validator is going to allow that resource under dataSourceRef field. And we can very easily see how do we install that dataSource validator. So if you see here, this is the manifest that actually installs that. So if we try to look here, if you see here, this is this is just one pod that runs in kube system namespace when you deploy it, and it validates, it looks for the PVC resources, and it validates if the resource that has been specified under dataSourceRef is a valid volume populator or not. So yeah, we can very easily do that when we are going to implement it. I will show you how to deploy that and everything. In this particular video, we are just going to look into the internals of all these things. Now, let's talk about controllers. So now you have, let's say, created a PVC, and as soon as you created PVC with dataSourceRef field, you have installed validator. So that validator actually looked into API group and kind, and it said that this is a valid volume populator because it has already been registered using volume populator resource. Now what happens is this particular controller comes into picture, and this is the most important piece of the puzzle, let's say. So this controller is also listening for all the PVC resources, and as soon as it gets to know about this particular PVC resource, this is where you are going to write all the logic, let's say the entire logic that you want to do to create or to populate the PVC with some data. So what happens is, if I try to talk about in detail, when you create a PVC resource, again, if you have watched my CSI plugin video, you would know that as soon as PVC is created, the external provisioner component that would be present on Kubernetes cluster, would get to know about this, and that provisioner would actually try to, in normal scenarios, that external provisioner component would try to call the CSI plugin. But in this particular case, this is not the normal scenario. In this particular case, we have a dataSourceRef field under PVC resource. And because external provisioner doesn't know about dataSourceRef field, it's not going to do anything. So if I try to write down the points here, so when we create PVC, PVC would be in pending state, and it would be in pending state because even though external provisioner looked into the PVC resource, it doesn't know the data source ref field, and that is the reason external provisioner will not be able to do anything. And because external provisioner will not be able to do anything, the PVC is in pending state right now. So it's just a PVC resource that is pending, and your controller, the controller that we are going to write, this particular controller is also going to watch for the PVC resources, and as soon as it gets to know about the PVC resource, it actually provisions a volume. So now you have another PVC resource that is bound to a PV and eventually to a volume. So now your controller is going to provision another PVC, and it's actually going to be bound to a PV and eventually to a volume, and your controller or part of your controller is going to write the data into this using this particular PVC. So now your controller, or let's say a part of controller, is going to write the data into PVC. And this is the same data that you want to create your PVC with, because that is the whole purpose of writing volume populators. So we have created, so your controller is going to or should be able to create a PVC, and that is the PVC that we are going to use to write some data into it. And once the data has been written, the third step is going to be deleting this PVC and mounting the PV with original PVC that was created by user. So if you see here now, this PVC, let's say this is the PVC that is called test1, and this is the PVC that is called controller1, because controller created it, let's say, and the PV name is again controller PV1. So in this particular case, once the data has been written into this PVC, again we are going to talk about how the data is actually written, but once the data has been written into the PVC, mounting the PV which is CPV1 with the original PVC, and original PVC is test1. So now as soon as we not mount, the correct word here would be bind the PV with the original PVC that was created by the user, and then eventually delete the PVC C1. So now that you have deleted, now that controller has deleted C1, in that case CP1 is actually bound to test1, and because you have written the data into the volume and that is persisted into this volume, now if you try to, so now you have created a PVC that is test1 that eventually has some data populated, and this is the entire process of, I would say, writing a volume populator. Now we are actually going to look into this particular step, that is second step here, in much more detail in just a second, but I hope this makes sense. And so let's go ahead and try to basically maybe draw a diagram, and that might make more sense. So let's say I have created my volume populator, and this is the volume populator controller, and in the application namespace, let's say this is my application namespace or the namespace where I want to create a PVC. So a PVC was created here, and this is stuck in pending state. So this is stuck in pending state because external provisioner looked into the DataSourceRef field, and it was not able to. It did not know what exactly DataSourceRef field is. So this is stuck in pending state. Volume Populator is also listening for the PVC resources, and as soon as it got to know about this PVC resource with DataSourceRef field, it created another PVC resource here, and it would be bound to a PV resource, and which would eventually point to a volume in the cloud storage somewhere, let's say. Now once it happened, your volume populator should be able to write the data to this particular volume. And so what can be done is, in that case, to write the data to a particular PVC, I mean, you might know that we need to mount this PVC to a new pod, right? So we somehow need to create a new pod. So we have to create a new pod, and we have to mount this PVC in this new pod. And once we have mounted this PVC in this new pod, now from this pod we can write the data into this PVC. And if we write the data into this PVC, we know that this data is going to be persisted into this volume here that is created in the cloud provider, let's say. Once I have written the data successfully, when I say I actually mean the volume populator. The volume populator is just the controller that we are going to write. That is going to listen for the PVC resources. So once the pod has completed writing the data into PVC, this pod is going to get terminated, and now we have PVC, PV, and volume here. So what we are going to do is, we are going to, again, PVs are not namespace resources. So we can refer to this PVC from the PVC here, and now this PVC is pointing to this particular PV. And eventually, if I delete this particular PVC, so now you have a PVC in application namespace that is pointing to a valid persistent volume, and that is pointing to a volume in the storage provisioner. So now you have a PVC in bound state, right, with some data that was written by your controller. So I hope this makes sense. Let me quickly try to summarize it. So we are going to write a volume populator, and this volume populator is just a controller. We know about controller. We have writing controller. We have written a lot of controllers, I would say, if you have watched the channel. And as soon as we create a PVC with dataSourceRef field, external provisioner is going to get notified, but external provisioner would not do anything because it does not know about the dataSourceRef field. So that is the reason PVC would be in pending state, and it would be stuck in pending state. And then our volume populator would get to know about this PVC resource. It would look into the dataSourceRef field, and then it would create a PVC. And when it creates a PVC resource, this would be a new PVC resource, but it would have almost the same spec that we have specified here. So for example, if we have specified here the spec to be, let's say, the storage request to be 30 gigs, in that case this PVC that we create here is also going to be 30 gigs. So this is going to have the same spec per se. For example, this is going to have the same storage class and things like that. So once our controller has created this PVC, in that case, that PVC is going to get bound to a PV and eventually to a volume. And then our controller is going to create another pod. That pod is going to mount this PVC, this newly created PVC, and it's going to write all the data that is required in this PVC by mounting it. Here is the thing. Now you might ask, how do we know which data do we want to write? And the important point here is, if you remember, when we talked about the PVC resource here, I said that this CR that you created, this CR is going to have some fields, right? So for example, in this particular case, since we are creating CR of type HTTP volume populator, this would have a field called, let's say, HTTP URL, right? From where you want to populate the data from. So, and this would have basically all the details that are required under this would have all the details under spec field that are required to populate the data into your volume. So if I go back and look into this diagram again, so this pod is going to get created by our volume populator, and it's going to populate some data into this PVC. And this PVC, once the data has been populated, this PVC is going to get deleted, and the PV is going to get bound to the original PVC, and eventually we would have a PVC that would have some data in it. So now that we know about this, the other very important thing that I would like to talk about is this volume populator. So if you see here, we said that this volume populator is going to listen for the PVC resources, and it's going to create a PVC, and it should be able to mount this PVC to a newly created pod and things like that. So fortunately, a lot of these things I would say, there is a utility called volume populator machinery, and if we use that library, if we use that API, let's say, a lot of these things are taken care by that library itself, and we don't have to do any of these things. So for example, let's say now I'm talking about volume populator, this entire thing in much more detail. So we have to basically do some of the things. So the first thing is listen for PVC resources. Second is create pod. Second is create. I have bad handwriting here, so let me just go ahead and try to write this down. So the first step that volume populator is going to do is listen for PVC resources, and second step is create PVC with the same request, etc. And the third step is going to be create a pod mounting the above PVC. And fourth part is this new pod that is going to get created. Again, we have to configure this. So this pod should be create a pod mounting the above PVC, and let's say we have mounted the volume at mount/volume. So because we know that where exactly the PVC is mounted, the new pod that we create should be able to write the data into the PVC. And once the data has been written, the fifth step is going to be change PV's claim to user created PVC, and then eventually delete the controller created PVC. So now a lot of these things here are already actually can easily be done if we take help of volume populator machinery, API machinery. This is a library provided by the community, like we have client Go API machinery, etc. So this can be done very easily. We don't have to do this manually. So we are going to write a controller, but listening for the PVC resources can be done by API machinery easily. We don't have to do this. So this is already taken care, I would say. This is already handled by API machinery. Create PVC with the same request, etc. This is also already handled by API machinery. Create a pod mounting the above PVC. This is also already handled. So now the pod that we have created, this is the step that we have to mainly focus on, and change PV's claim to user created PVC, this is also already handled, and this is also already handled. So all these things all are easily handled by Volume Populator API machinery. We have to just focus on this pod that is going to actually populate the data. So now let's go ahead and try to look into that pod now. So let's say this is the pod that was created, and it has obviously mounted mount/wall PVC, which actually eventually points to a volume in the storage provider. So now what happens is this particular so and this pod is going to get created by Volume Populator controller that we are going to write, that is going to use API Volume Populator API machinery, Volume Populator API machinery. And when we start the controller using Volume Populator API machinery, and that API machinery, like I said, that API machinery is eventually going to create this pod, right? So when we start the controller using Volume Populator API machinery that is eventually going to create the pod, we can actually specify what are all the arguments that this pod needs to populate the data. So again, if I talk about the argument here, these are the container arguments. I hope you know about container arguments. So when we create a pod and we eventually specify a container inside that pod, for a container we can specify for the application that is running as a container, we can specify all the arguments that it accepts. So when we run the API machinery, we can specify the image for this particular pod that is going to get created, and we can also specify the argument using which this pod is going to get created. So in our case, like our name suggests, our volume populator is HTTP volume populator that is going to create a volume with the data that is present on any HTTP path, let's say. So in that case, if our pod knows about that HTTP URL, in that case our pod would be able to make a request to that HTTP URL, and it would be able to get the data from that URL and write the data to this particular PVC. So our pod as an argument just needs one thing, and that one thing is URL from where to download the data and write that to PVC, and that is the URL that we are going to get as part of the CR. So if you see here, I briefly talked about the CR. So this is how our CR is going to look like, and under CR we are going to take the URL, and our API machinery is going to call this pod. And when API machinery, when we use API machinery to basically start the controller, and that is the same controller that we have been talking about that does all the things, that also creates the pod, we can specify the arg field using which the pod is going to get created. Again, I'm emphasizing on a lot because this is the most important thing, I would say. So this is basically handled by you when you start the API machinery controller. When I say you, I mean when we are going to write it in our code. When we are going to start the API machinery controller, in that API machinery controller, because we have access to the CR that was created, we have access to the HTTP volume populator resource that is referenced in the PVC resource. So we have PVC resource, it specified dataSourceRef field, and it points to a particular CR instance. And we know this CR instance, so we know about URL. We know about URL in this particular controller that we are going to write. And because we know this URL, we can configure, we can create the arg field for this new pod that is going to get created by API machinery controller. So, and we can pass this arg field while starting the controller using volume populator API machinery. So I hope this makes sense. So if I try to explain this a bit further, now we have two components here. So we have this component that is going to actually use API machinery, volume populator API machinery to start the controller. And this controller would be able to do all these things automatically. We don't have to do any of these things excepting this one. So this populator that we are going to start is going to do all these, will be able to handle all these things automatically. So start that controller, and we will have to again write code for this pod, right? Because this pod is going to be handled by us. So we will have to write the application for that pod as well. So let's just go ahead and try to look into how we are going to do that. So there are a lot of ways to do that. So you can either have two component. One component is going to be volume populator controller. Again, it's a very minimal code that we are going to write. We are just going to use API machinery volume populator to create the controller. We are not going to actually write the controller code. This API machinery volume populator can be used to do that. So this is one thing. Once the controller is running, it is going to, obviously, like I said, it requires two main things. The image that it is going to create the new pod with, and the image and the argument, and this pod is going to get created with this argument. So it needs the image, it needs argument, and all these things can be done in our application. And then it also needs, we need to create, either we can create another application, right? And this application would know if a URL is given to this particular application and a particular PVC is mounted at a particular location, this particular application should be able to know how to write data to a particular path. So you can have another component that is going to get specified as image. And once we specify this particular application as image here, a new pod is going to get created, and this component, this application knows how to write data to a particular PVC. So this is one way. So you are going to have two applications. One application is actually going to start the controller with image and argument, and the other component is going to actually get run as part of this pod, and it is actually going to populate the PVC with some data. But the other approach that we can do is we can just have one application. Let me try to draw again. So you can just have one application, and in this one application what we can do is we can run this application in two modes. One mode can be controller and another mode can be populated. So by default, when we run this controller, we are going to run this in controller mode. Again, by default, when we install our volume populator, we are going to run our application or this application in controller mode, and then we are going to use volume populator API machinery to actually start the controller. And once the controller is started, in that particular case, what we can do is we can run the same application, but in the populate mode, right? So what we can do is we can specify. So let's say this application is the image Vivek Singh GZITS / volume populator :1. This is the image. So we can start the controller with the same image, but we can run this image in the populator mode, and we can toggle between the modes using the arg to our application. And you know that we can very easily configure the arg for the new pod that is going to get created. So for this new pod, we can specify, while starting the controller, we can specify one of the args is going to be mode, and mode is going to be populate, and another argument is going to be URL. URL is going to be the URL that was given in the populator custom resource instance. So let's say http dot something dot something, and the same application is going to get run in this particular pod, and it's going to populate the data into a PVC. So yeah, I hope this makes sense. I think I just talked about the things, so you might get confused a bit, but once we implement this entire thing in the next video, I'm pretty sure that things would make a much more sense. If I try to summarize again the populator that we are going to write in the next video, so we are going to write a volume populator that if that volume populator is specified in the PVC resource, this PVC is going to be populated with the CR with the URL that is specified in our volume populator. So for example, if I talk about this particular resource here, so if our eventual motive is to create a populator. So if I have created this particular volume populator called readme populator, and if I specify this readme populator while creating PVC, we are going to have a PVC created with the content that is there at this particular HTTP URL. So this is the eventual volume populator that we are going to write. So I hope this makes sense. This is pretty much it that I wanted to talk about in this particular video. Again, I'm going to summarize this, but since I just talk about things might not. I mean, you might have a lot of questions, but I'm pretty sure that most of these things are going to get clarified in the next video. So if I try to summarize, you are going to create a PVC resource, and under dataSourceRef we can specify any custom resource field. And since we know that dataSourceRef actually doesn't accept any invalid sources, in that case we need a validator. The validator is already written by the Kubernetes community. The validator is already written by the Kubernetes community, so we don't have to write that, we just have to deploy that. But to make sure that validator is able to figure out that this particular kind and API group is a valid data source populator, we will have to register our populator with Kubernetes. And to register our populator, we will have to create a resource of type volume populator, and volume populators are not by default available, so you will have to create a CRD to make that resource available. And once volume populator is available, you have to create an instance of volume populator to register your volume populator with Kubernetes. Now, once you have registered your volume populator, you can create a PVC resource specifying an instance of that volume populator. In our case, like I said, we want to provision the volume with the data that is present on an HTTP URL. In that case, this is how our spec is going to, this is a rough idea of how our spec is going to look like. And once we have specified that, the external provisioner, again it's related to CSI, external provisioner is going to look into the PVC. It would not be able to do anything because it would not understand this dataSourceRef field. But our PVC that we see here, our PVC would also be listening to, our controller would also be listening to that PVC that has been specified here. And this particular controller that we are going to write, that would actually consist of two components, actual controller and populator. So this component would listen for this PVC, it would create a temporary PVC, and PVC would create eventually would have a PV bound to it, and which would refer to a volume in the storage provider. And then our controller is going to create a pod, and that pod is going to write the data into this PVC. Once the data has been written, this PVC is going to get bound to this particular PV resource, and once it has happened, eventually this PV is going to get deleted, and now we have a PVC with some data in it. And most of these things that I talked about, for example, listening to the PVC, creating a pod, mounting the PVC into the new pod, temporary pod, is already handled by, uh, can easily be done by using Populator API machinery that we are going to look into in the next video. So yeah, I hope this makes sense. If you have any question, feel free to reach out to me. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much.